Hey folks, this is Layman Pascal. Welcome to My Kind of Country, an integral stage sub-series looking at politics and nationhood through the lens of metacognitive thinkers and feelers. And who better to discuss all this stuff with than the OG of contemporary integral meta theory, the venerable Ken Wilber. Viewers and listeners might know that after Donald Trump's first presidential victory in 2016, Ken put out a provocative book called Trump in a Post-Truth World to help with public sense-making and to fill an explanatory gap he was seeing across the public discourse. I highly recommend that book with its deep dives into the relationship between postmodern cultural values and information technology, its intimations of a hopeful integral politics, and its rich evaluation of what he called the reverberating anti-green morphic field. But today in 2024, the United States has re-elected Donald Trump with an even greater majority. Is this country trapped in the same loop? Has it somehow not succeeded in accomplishing a crucial cultural rebalancing? Are things different now, or are they basically the same as when Ken's book came out? It seems like an excellent moment to check back in with Ken about the theses he outlined in that book, about where America is right now and where it might need to start going, and about any of his personal reflections and feelings as a respected, wise elder who has witnessed a lifetime of American politics. We're very pleased and happy to have him with us. Welcome, Ken.
Hi, buddy. Great to be here.
Okay, if you don't mind me starting in a kind of a personal way, what does it feel like to be an integral American right now? What's your sense of the collective vibe?
Yeah. Well, Donald Trump is always an interesting character. So for him to win and win as big as he did causes an enormous reverberation throughout the country. And we're all sort of trying to figure out just why did he win so big? And I think it's a combination of factors, including the basic one, which is just that Kamala Harris was a very bad candidate. She just didn't work very well. She had an enormous number of problems and difficulties. And I got tired of hearing almost every interviewer describe her responses as, quote, word salad. But they were. She just never could quite pull things together in a sensible fashion. So it's very important to distinguish between what Trump does and what he says. And I found from his first time around that what he did was fairly good and actually fairly healthy. But what he said, of course, was just a mess and just a nightmare of causing all sorts of strife and difficulties and anger even and hatred for some people. But I think he's going to be relatively good for this country in terms of what he actually does. But we'll have to find out. We'll see. So I'm sort of on the cusp of the let's wait and see fringe and sort of moving on from there.
All right. I was going back and I was rereading Trump in a Post-Truth World, and it really struck me right from the introduction of that book, saying that the election came as a shock to a lot of people. The left is responding with alarm. The right is smug and saying everything's going to change and we're going to get even. And there's a whole bunch of underlying sense making that nobody's mentioning. It sounded pretty much the same as the situation right now. Do you feel like it's changed somehow, or are we stuck basically in the same position we were in 8 years ago?
I actually think that Trump himself has changed a fair amount. The first time around, for example, in his cabinet, he chose fairly qualified people, but they didn't have much loyalty to him. And so a lot of them ended up bad-mouthing him and turning on him and stuff like that. I think he learned his lesson there. So he's putting in people that are highly qualified, but great disruptors. But they have a lot of loyalty towards him. And I think in terms of getting something accomplished, that's a good idea, because of course you want all people working together and ostensibly around the president himself. And I think he's got a much better chance of having that happen now. So, other than that, I don't think there's that much of a difference between the times as they were then and the times as they are now. What we can take away from this recent election is that, and I'll have to mention some terms that we'll get to later, so bear with me. But Trump was essentially housed in an orange rational stage of development. And Kamala Harris was coming from basically the next higher stage, which we call green or postmodern, but it was an unhealthy version of green, what I call the mean green meme. And so that was when people hear that kind of fragmented and disjointed statement, no matter what level it's coming from, it always hits them as if something's not right here. It doesn't sound right. I don't like it. And I think what this election showed is that if Americans have to choose between a broken green and a relatively healthy orange, or a broken postmodern, pluralistic, multicultural view, or a healthy, rational, universal, systemic view, they'll choose the rational, universal view. And that makes a certain sense because everybody at green has gone through orange, because each stage of development transcends and includes its predecessor. So if you're at green, it means you have gone through orange. And so green is sort of the way you leadingly think, but you can recognize orange, of course, and you tend to still use it. And probably 30 to 40% of your psyche is made up of orange. So, but Americans had a clean choice between either or. And instead of the postmodern green, they chose modern orange. So instead of postmodern multiculturalism, they chose a modern rational approach. And that's sort of interesting in a way, but we didn't have a very good representative of the green stage. So that's sort of how that went.
How much attention do you pay to politics and elections? Is it something that gets 1% of your attention, or is it something you find interesting and relevant?
Well, it's something I find fairly interesting and certainly relevant. And um, but then I'm interested in a whole lot of things, being a fairly integral type of thinker. This was an interesting matchup, particularly because it was so uneven. Um, and so I watched it with a great deal of interest and concern. And I just wish that we had had a better representative of green multicultural postmodernism. She wasn't a very good example of that stage of development.
Yeah, that leads me to one of my curiosities, which is, looking at this book, for example, one of the main arguments is that progressive, pluralistic, postmodern leading edge of culture hasn't shown up in a healthy, balanced way, particularly in the United States. And
Right,
this creates a kind of derangement and imbalance in the evolutionary stack, which triggers an anti-green morphic field. And so
right.
the problem is not just that people are regressing to mythic thinking and ethno nationalism, it's actually a more general reaction against the pluralism that we have here. But in a
Right.
context like this, like what is Integral's main job? Should we be more focused on trying to create ways to transcend green, or more focused on trying to help green arrive in a more healthy, complete, balanced version of itself?
Well, of course, both of them are important. And if we're ever going to see real change, both of those will have to be included in some sense. But I think right now, one of the best things we can do is help the pluralistic green revive itself. It just got knocked out completely. And as people rushed in to vote for orange rational, which is a modernist view or a world-centric view, and green is called postmodern because it's post-rational or post-orange, post-systemic reason. And that's not good because it's from our green platform that we move into so-called second tier or integral modes of thinking. And that's a very important stage. And it's important that we have as many of the population as possible coming from an integral stage. Because they can see multiple perspectives, they can see most sides of an argument, and they're always pulling for ways to compromise or integrate the various viewpoints. And so it's particularly a useful level to have if you're in politics. And I'm sure that when we get somebody coming from the integral level, that they'll think of some fairly innovative and constructive ways to present their political viewpoint. And that would all be helped if we had a healthy green giving rise to integral. But as it is now with the broken green or the mean green meme, that's not offering much of a boost up. It's not a sturdy platform from which to anchor your leap into second tier integral thinking. And so that's really unfortunate. And darn, Kamala, for that. But I'm sure she's a very nice person.
Well, that's why you got to have primaries before you have the election, I guess.
That's right. Among other things, that was where it started to go wrong.
A lot of the people I talk to in our communities feel like maybe the country missed an interesting opportunity with the Bernie Sanders movement a few years ago. What was your sense of him? Is that a healthier version of Green, or what was your impression of Bernie?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I liked Bernie. He's a likable sort. And my problem is more with his socialist approach. Because just from a political standpoint, there are some very good things about socialism, but there's some very deleterious things about it. In some ways, it's really problematic. And so, strangely, when I think of Bernie Sanders, I think of his theory more than I think of his psyche or his self or his personality. But if I focus on his personality, I liked him. I thought he was very sharp, very bright guy, very responsible. And I don't think I would have voted for him, depending on what the field is. But I found him a very likable fellow. And I didn't see any major, huge pathologies. He was just a mistaken socialist thinker.
One of the ideas I play with sometimes is that the world is getting increasingly strange, and that in
Right,
order to be a good politician, you have to be astonishing, right? And Trump was astonishing.
right.
Maybe it's just fanciful, but what's your take on that? Do you think in order to be a real political force, no matter what level you're coming from, you have to sort of blow people's minds?
Yeah, I think anything that makes an impression, and that includes the type you're talking about, a very sort of zany, insane, crazy, extravagant person, they almost always make an impression. And then if their craziness is sort of a good type of craziness, where it's just like um, it's just wild stuff, but not totally off the wall stuff, then they've got a fairly good chance of being elected. But if it's crazy, like, Uncle Joe is really crazy, then that doesn't work very well. And most politicians that are Uncle Joe crazy don't make it through a primary, for example, which is why it's good to have primaries. So I guess that's about it for that.
Okay. One of the important things I think you did with this book was to really clearly spell out the relationship between the intersubjective postmodern cultural values and our current interobjective information technology, which
Right,
I think has become even more relevant in the last 8 years because now we have deep fakes and AI persuasion
right,
systems and things like
right,
that that really accelerate the nihilism. But
right.
there's another kind of like shared external system, which is our elections and our voting procedures. And I wonder if you think it's possible for America to really make progress using its current kind of voting systems and collective decision making protocols, or whether there has to be a change in how we choose and decide if we're going to start operating at a higher level.
Could you give me an alternative example of how we might?
Sure. Well, I mean, very simple ones are like ranked choice voting. There's proportional representation. There might be ways to use averages rather than majorities, right? Like, obviously, if a state is won by 51 to 49, then basically half of the people's information just gets canceled in that state.
Right.
There's a number of different voting reform movements out there. I just wonder if there's a ceiling on the changes we can make just because of the systems we're using.
Well, I'm sure there is. And for me to choose an alternative, I would really have to see the alternative laid out. And it would have to be done in a fair amount of detail, because after all, this would be a monumental change in how we go about doing things. Like, I don't know which of those, the alternatives that you mentioned, I don't know how integral each of them is. I haven't looked into them that carefully. Um, so I would, of course, hope if we're going to change the system, that we would change the system so that it's more inclusive in its embrace. Like you say, if a state votes 49-51, half of their are just gone. Um, and that strikes me as somehow weird. So I don't particularly like that. Um, so we would, I would have to see the
Sure.
alternative form laid out in detail, and then I'd make a choice. But I do think that there is plenty of room for that kind of improvement.
What's your emotional relationship to the country you live in? Do you feel like you love America? Do you feel patriotic, or does that sort of occupy a distant memory?
Yeah. Well, of course, I'm a globalist in terms of my thought, but I still feel a great deal of fondness for America. I've never liked the term patriot because the people that usually describe themselves as patriots are crazy Uncle Joe types. But I would suppose that in objective truth, I am a bit of a patriot. I like America's history. I'm fairly proud of it. I think we have a good history. It upsets me deeply to see the far left spend so much of their time trashing the history of the United States. There's just, first of all, that's historically lame and inept and stupid. Um, but it's also just crazy. I mean, a real crazy Joe crazy. And that's what the far left spends all its time doing. So much for them. But I feel, I guess I'm sort of halfway between actually transitioning from a nationalistic stance to a globalist stance. And I'm sort of half, half and half. Um, Although I think globally and act locally. And I can notice the gap between the two when I notice that I don't like to identify myself as an American. I mean, if it were just talking with a bunch of people, it's not something I want to make an announcement about. And so I can see a bit of hesitancy there. Um, but nonetheless, my deepest core is American. And I'm basically proud of it.
A lot of the
Are
book,
you? I,
well, I'm Canadian, but
okay.
I have the same kind of relationship to my country, and also Canada and the United States are so deeply entangled that often I'll say we when I mean the United
Yeah,
States.
right. Okay. That's fair.
Um, a lot of the book is a critique of failed versions of pluralism,
All right.
and it brings up a kind of not an argument, but a difference of feeling that I see in these communities where some people are really sensitive to the mean green meme and other people are really sensitive to the mean orange meme. And you
Right.
see it play like if you think about problems at universities, right? Is it woke sensitivity or is it it's sold out to capitalism and it's a customer is always right mentality? So
Right.
how do you analyze the role of modernity and liberalism and orange in potentially setting up the problems that you've critiqued in this book and that you see in the country at large?
All right. Well, first of all, I'll say some nice things about Orange. Um, First of all, it's the first world centric stage that we have. And world centric means, well, I can just give the general stages that lead up to world centric. The earliest stages, all of us in the first 2 or 3 years of life are what's called egocentric. We can't take the role of other. We can't imagine. If I'm talking to you, I can't imagine what you're thinking, or I can't see things from your stance. Um, and it's a very first person oriented view. First person is described as the perspective of the person speaking. So it's an I, me, mine. Second person is the perspective of the person being spoken to. So that's a you, thy, thine. And third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So that's a he, she, they, them, it, or its. Um, and our first set of identity, what we call ourselves, is an egocentric identity. And then when we get into age 5, 6, 7, we start moving from what Piaget called pre-operational thinking to concrete operational thinking. And concrete operational thinking is defined as thought operating on the world. And one of the things that being able to operate on the world means I can also take a second person perspective. So when I move up to concrete operational thinking, I'll be able to understand you and have some idea of what viewpoint you're thinking from and what your perspective is. Um, and that is also where a basic cognitive form that humans have is called mythic. The egocentric stage is called magic, and it's called magic because the mind has not yet differentiated from the thing it's aware of. So also if the mind writes a word like TREE, the word, the symbol represents a real tree. And magic can't yet differentiate between those two very easily because it's still sort of identified with most of its surroundings because its brain has not learned to differentiate self and not self. So, with that identity, if you change the symbol representing the thing, you think you change the thing as well. And we can see this in very old forms of religion like voodoo. if you're upset with somebody, if I'm really pissed at you, I'll make a doll that looks like you. And then I think that if I get a knife and stab the doll, I'm really stabbing you because I can't tell the real difference between the symbol representing you and you. The signifier and the referent are not yet differentiated because the mind is still too young to make those kinds of distinctions. When we move from magic to mythic, which is the form of worldview that concrete operational thinking has, we can no longer perform magic, but we don't just get rid of it. We assign it to a whole host of mythic beings: Zeus, Aphrodite, Apollo, Mars, Jupiter, and so on. And they all live on Mount Olympus and whatnot. So those are the first forms of real, sort of what we think of as commonplace religion. Magic also has a form of religion. I mentioned voodoo, but it's very primitive, and very few present day humans have a magic religion. Although you can always regress to magic, and many postmodern types do. And so we have teens who are playing Wicca and magic and all of that kind of stuff. But most people transfer all of their magic capacities to a supernatural god or goddess or elemental spirit. And then the whole point of these new religions, and there are around maybe 7 or so well-known world religions, and probably 20, and sometimes there are hundreds different types. But the mythic world religions like Christianity, Hinduism, Taoism, Sufism, Judaism, and so on, have a belief in a supernatural being or beings. Most of these religions started in their pluralistic or multiple polytheistic forms. And we have created a whole set of practices that we can do to make our God, chosen God, happy. And one of them was sacrifice. And of course, this meant animal sacrifice. But when sacrifice was first introduced with the mythic period, which started around 10,000 BCE, and we in America know about the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incas. These were all mythic societies, and they all had human sacrifice, which is a very common form of early sacrifice. And the Aztecs, of course, would build these huge pyramid-shaped buildings with a whole row of steps going up the front. And they would walk the sacrificial victim all the way up the steps, stretch him out on a table, and then the priest would cut his heart out, literally, stab him with a knife, open his chest, and pull his heart out, and then eat his heart. And that was a sacrifice to the sun god, and that would make their crops flourish. And then they'd push the dead body down the stairs, and it would roll all the way to the bottom, where it would be picked up by the townsfolk, taken back to their huts, cooked and eaten. So, we have a pretty fun history, and that's nice to know. But that's still the mythic, and there are several dozen developmental models, and Gene Gebser's the one that named them archaic stage, magic stage, mythic stage, rational stage, pluralistic stage, and integral stage, which tends to be the general terms that I use, although there are more than 6 or 7 stages there are at least 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. But the mythic stage is still a stage that has a very strong hold on average humanity. And it's just the mythic stage is a second person only stage, so it can deal with second persons, but it can deal with a fair number of them. So they can deal with more than egocentric tribes. And so when we move to mythic, we can bring together numerous tribes under one all-encompassing god or goddess, or several gods and goddesses. And that still tends to be a fairly strong stage of development for most human beings. Of course, all the stages are still included in us. We go through each and every one of them. And as we do, we transcend and include the previous stage. So we're including it in our makeup, plus adding a higher stage. We're transcending it in some sense. And that transcend and include is a standard form that we see in all types of evolution. So if you just look at the natural world, you see electrons, protons, and neutrons coming together in atoms. And an atom transcends, but includes protons, neutrons, and electrons. And you can actually see them in the atom because they're physically included. And then several atoms come together to form molecules. And the molecule transcends the atom, but includes it. And it physically includes it. You can see all the atoms in a large molecule. And then molecules come together and are transcended and included by a living cell. And the molecules are actually inside the cell. You can see them with a microscope and so on. They're very real. They're transcended and included. And then these multicellular units are transcended and included in multicellular animals, plants and animals. And they have different cells for heart tissue, lung tissue, intestine, and so on. And so we have this transcend and include going on. And then the stage right beyond mythic is the rational stage, the orange rational stage. The mythic stage we call amber, and the egocentric stage we call magenta. And they're the rational stage is where you can take a third person point of view. So you can think about he, she, they, them, it, or its. You can think in terms of strict logic. You can think of mathematical terms. So you can invent algebra just in your head. And Piaget defines formal operational thinking, which is rationality, as thought operating on thought. Remember, the previous stage, concrete operational thinking, was thought operating on the world. And that's just the physical world. So thought operating on the physical world. And then the rational stage is thought operating on thought. So you can see we're moving up the great chain of being. The great chain of being is a conception you find in virtually all of the world's great religions. And it's the way they intuited the major stages of development that human beings go through. And so the Christian version of the great chain of being is matter to body to mind to soul to spirit. And that's a very good way to summarize the great chain of being. So we can see that we're moving up the great chain, because we started out, we were identified with just the physical world, and we couldn't even tell ourselves apart from the physical world. So the brain would be confused with the things it was seeing. And then when we go from magic to mythic, we're moving up um, from matter into body and the beginning of mind. And when we move into rationality, the mind is emerging and operating on the mind. And so we can see we're moving up, getting closer to spirit and soul and spirit. So um, the the basic movement through all of these levels is was discovered around 100 years ago in what's called developmental psychology. And notice it was only discovered about 100 years ago. It was discovered by America's probably second greatest psychologist, James Mark Baldwin, with William James being its premier psychologist. And the two of them, incidentally, were good friends. They both taught at Harvard and they corresponded a lot. And interestingly, William James was studying what I call states of consciousness, and I also call it waking up. This is like getting an enlightenment experience, an awakening experience. And in waking up, you feel that you are no longer identified with your separate small self. You're one with the whole world. You're one with reality. You're one with God, if you want to use that term. And William James studied those and wrote a book called The Variety of Religious Experience. And what he would point out is that what most people think about religion is not really the core of religion. Most people think of Christianity, they think of, well, there's one God who's the creator of the universe, and he also had sex with Mary, a virgin, and she gave birth to the one and only Son of God, and he was died and resurrected 3 days later and ascended in heaven, and all that mythic kind of stuff. But William James says that's not what religion is really about. What it's about are these direct, mystical, spiritual experiences. And all the major world's religions have a very small but very important sub-school of mysticism. So there are Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart, St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila. There are Hindu mystics, there are Buddhist mystics, there are Taoist mystics, there are Jewish mystics, there are Islamic mystics. The entire school of Sufism is a school of Islamic mystics. And that's a very important distinction to make. I call it the difference between waking up and growing up. Waking up consists of a series of direct first person experiences. So it's an experience that I, me, or mine can have. And waking up is an experience of third person structures of consciousness. And a structure of consciousness is sort of like grammar. You and I are now following a whole set of rules of grammar, but you and I can't introspect and see these rules of grammar. We have no idea what they are. The last time we knew what they were was when we first learned them in grammar school, and the rules were actually taught, and we'd write them down and sort of learn them, and then a month later we'd forget about them, and that's the last we would ever see them again. But that's because they're third person it. So and that's the difference between what I call growing up, because those all grow through these stages of development that we're talking about, versus waking up, which is a direct, immediate first person experience. If you're sitting in the woods and you're meditating, and all of a sudden you have a waking up experience and you're one with everything, you're one with the earth, you're one with the sun, you're one with the stars, you're one with a flock of birds flying over, you know it. I mean, you're flooded with love and bliss and the super awareness, and you're completely, fully aware of a waking up experience. But when it comes to growing up, you have no idea what stage of growing up you're at. You don't know if you're at a magic stage, mythic stage, rational stage, pluralistic stage, or integral stage. And what's more, you can't find out by looking within. So I started talking about this because I said those growing up stages were only discovered about 100 years ago. And that's because nobody could see them by looking within. And so it took, but unlike a waking up experience where you absolutely know you're having it, you know what its contours are, you know what it's about, but not so growing up. Growing up just moves silently behind, but it creates the worldview or the perspectives that we have on the world at every stage of development. And again, there are at least the archaic stage, magic stage, mythic stage, rational stage, pluralistic stage, and integral stage. Um, so the reason that growing up, that waking up has been around and has been known for at least 50,000 years, probably longer, maybe even a billion years. But growing up, 100 years. That's not very impressive. It actually was discovered about the same time that Freud wrote his first book. So psychoanalysis of the depth unconscious is only about 100 years old too. So those are two very important avenues of human awareness, but we are just recently aware of both of them. So that's growing up, and growing up goes through at least through the integral stages, and there are probably 3 or 4 higher stages that will come to in the future as we continue to grow and evolve. And I've written about what these might be like, and you can pick up any of my books if you want to know. So that's waking up and growing up. And then I'll also mention that I mentioned opening up, cleaning up, and showing up. And all 5 of those, waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up, all 5 of those make the overall integral approach. Because what we're looking for are different degrees of wholeness, different types of wholeness. And waking up gives us a very clear wholeness with the entire universe. But growing up also, remember, each stage of growing up, it consists of what Arthur Koestler called a holon. It's a whole that's a part of a larger whole. So each stage transcends and includes its predecessor. So it gives us an increasing degree of wholeness. And the integral stage is named the integral stage because it integrates all of the stages that came before. So that gives us a very real type of wholeness. Opening up is we don't just have one type of intelligence, cognitive intelligence. We have emotional intelligence, aesthetic intelligence, the perception of beauty, spatial intelligence, verbal intelligence, interpersonal or social intelligence, spiritual intelligence, and so on. And so if we become aware of our multiple intelligences, that's also a great increase in this type of wholeness that we have access to. Cleaning up is generally associated with the names Sigmund Freud and his inner circle. His inner circle were 4 or 5 very bright psychologists. As a matter of fact, every one of his inner circle were bona fide geniuses. On an IQ test, they all scored at genius level. And most of their names are known. Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, Otto Rank, and so on. So what cleaning up is well, Freud was once asked, what is it that this new psychoanalysis of yours does? And he very famously replied, where id was their ego shall be. And most people know the terms id and ego and libido and all that from Freud. They're Freudian terms. What most people don't know is that Freud himself never once used any of those terms. He never used the term id. He never used the term ego. They were put in his work by his official translator, James Strachey, because they're Latin terms, and Strachey thought the Latin terms made Freud sound more scientific. The term Freud really used were the German pronouns. So for id, he used the it. And Latin for it is id. And for ego, he used self. Latin for self is ego. And so what he said was, for it was there I shall become. So what did he mean by that? Freud noticed that when people repress material, and that was sort of one of his discoveries, was the fact that we can repress material that we don't like, push it out of our mind, push it into the unconscious, and then from there we can often project it onto other people. So, like if I have a great deal of anger at you, but I don't want to admit that anger, I'll push it out of my mind. And then I'll usually project the anger onto you and think you're mad at me. So, and we all have people in our lives that we have a little bit of trouble with, and they're the result of our shadow projections. And so when Freud said, where it was, there I shall become, what he meant was we should take this anger back and reunite it with our I. So how do you do that? Another one of Freud's followers, Fritz Perls, who was a superstar at Esalen Institute. Esalen is a famous growth center in America. It was actually the first growth center ever created in America by my friend Mike Murphy. And it was so popular that by the end of the first year that Esalen was up and running, there were 300 growth centers in America, all modeled on Esalen. So Murphy was simply left this absolutely stunningly gorgeous piece of land in Big Sur, California, which is right on the edge of the Pacific. And there were a couple of old buildings in it, and he simply started creating classes in like meditation or therapy or alternative ways of growth, which is why it was known as the growth center. And he invited Fritz Perls, and Perls had invented a form of therapy he called Gestalt therapy. Gestalt is German for whole. So you can see that this is going towards a wholeness, which is why I include it in a different type of wholeness and call it cleaning up. But what Perls would do is maybe 100 people would come to his workshop for that day. And so he'd ask the audience, who wants to work? Meaning, who wants to come up and work with me on a problem you've got? And he'd set a chair down, and the person would come up, he'd put in that chair. Then he'd put an empty chair in front of the person. And he'd say, okay, what's your problem? And they might say, like, well, I've got this anxiety and it's killing me. And Freud noticed that whenever people repress stuff and shove it into the unconscious, they start, because it's now a third person, they start to refer to it with a third person pronoun, usually it. So the depression, it controls me, or the obsession, I can't overcome it, or the anxiety, it overwhelms me. And so Perls would say, okay, you have anxiety. Okay, I want you to take that anxiety and put it in this empty chair and talk to it. And the person could like, what do you mean talk to it? Well, ask it something. Ask and say, like, what? Well, ask it, why are you doing this to me? Why are you slamming me with all this anxiety? And they say, okay, why are you doing this to me? And they say, okay, now sit in the chair and answer. Why are you doing that to you? And so he'd say, okay, I'm anxiety. Why am I doing this? Um, because you're stupid, you're an idiot, you get everything wrong or whatever. And he'd say, okay, no, I want you to just continue have a conversation. And for 10 or 15 minutes, they would have engaged in this conversation. And notice what's really happening. They're an I, but when they speak as anxiety, they're identified with an it. And so the more they become that it, the more they're re-owning it, the more they're taking it back into their own I self. And everybody in the audience could see that after 10 or 15 minutes, this person's anxiety was just diminishing. And Pearls had famously said, I can cure any neurosis in 15 minutes. And the funny thing is, even his harshest critics who hated Pearls agreed with him. He was a genius when it came to dealing with neurosis. And so that's what Freud meant when he said, where it was, there I shall become. And so I call that cleaning up, and that's another form of wholeness. And if you think it's not that widespread, just look around for the many things in your environment that annoy you, that upset you, that anger you, that disturb you. And psychologists will point out that all of those are your own projections. You're projecting something negative onto the external world. Like I could project my anger onto you. Um, and so um, if you want to know just how widespread that is, try spending a day just noticing the things that annoy you in the environment. And then if you want to play the empty chair with yourself or just in your mind and play it, act it, play like you're that thing, whatever is annoying you in the environment, and go back, talk back and forth to it. And you'll find that you're starting to re-own it. And that's just a very simple way to do psychoanalysis on yourself. Um, but that's cleaning up. And the last one is showing up. And showing up, I usually indicate showing up by drawing it in four quadrants. And the reason I do it in four quadrants is when I first thought of it, I just took one of those big yellow legal pads and I just drew a cross on it so that it had four corners. And in the upper part of the two upper quadrants were individual items, and the two lower quadrants were collective items. And the left-hand quadrants were quadrants made of consciousness, and the right-hand quadrants are quadrants made of matter. So we have the inside and the outside of an individual and a collective. And I found that all four of those have very real realities. And if you look at forms of epistemology in philosophy, and you look at the four quadrants, and you just put like a circle in each quadrant representing a holon, and it has an inside and an outside, and you'll notice that there's a different type of epistemology that's created by each of those 8 zones. And all 8 of those epistemologies exist. They're all dealt with in any course on philosophy. They're all very real types of realities. And so what you want to do, this comes as news to most people. But what I also discovered is that these quadrants just represent first, second, third, and fourth person perspectives. So the upper left is the interior of an individual. That's an I, me, or mine. And the lower left is the individual of a group or collective. So that's a you plus an I, which is a we or an us, and that's culture. And the right-hand quadrant are material, exterior, time and space. And so in the upper right, which is an individual, we have individual protons, neutrons, electrons, individual atoms, individual molecules, individual multicellular animals, and then all the way up a tree of life. And those are all the exterior, objective, material things and events in this universe. And the lower right is a group of those individual things, just like the lower left culture is a group of I's and U's. Um, and so we get um, an I, we, it, and its. And they do each have a different way of knowing the world, and all of them are very valid methods of knowing. And if we know that, we'll find ourselves sort of thinking, well, what would the world look like through this perspective? Or what would the world look like through this perspective? Um, and that offers a stunning increase in the things you're actually aware of. And if you don't believe it, just try it one day. Just get one of my books and look at the four quadrants and all the things that are in them, and then just try to look at the world through one of those quadrants, and you'll see the enormous expanse that just automatically tends to happen as you're looking through them. So that's the sum total of the integral model. It has waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up. And well, I'll just stop with that. I wanted
Okay.
to give a chance to give the
Yeah,
whole.
yeah, yeah. Great overview. Um, I'm thinking about the sort of quadrants because you ended there and how that relates to things like sex and gender in political spaces, right? Because I think integral consciousness is very good at sidestepping this ridiculous argument like, is gender biological or cultural? Like the answer is yes,
Right. Yeah.
right? So we're good at doing that. But one of the things we see, I think in this election, we saw very strongly that the anti-green morphic field was really critical of the seeming refusal of masculine energy in a way. Like obviously Integral wants to support the rise and the return and the healthy unfolding of the feminine.
Right.
But do you see the return of the masculine as an essential part of rebalancing the leading edge of American culture?
Yes. And I don't see it happening. So that's a real weak point in our culture. Um, Toxic masculinity is a single phrase. It's a single word. Wherever you find masculinity is always toxic. And that's just a nightmare. That's a horrible way to bring up a young male, to start telling him, oh, you're toxic all through and through. There's nothing you can do to get out of it. So just accept the fact that you're a horrible person. I mean, that's just indescribably wretched. But that's what we generally have, particularly from, again, the upper left talking classes. They just all assume masculinity is toxic. And that's just a horrible way to do it. In terms of where sex and gender are located, sex is the upper right quadrant. It's the exterior of an individual, this material, physical form. And that includes the genitals and sexual organs and all of that. And then gender, or your response to sex, is the upper left quadrant, the interior consciousness quadrant. And that's where you think about what your sex is and what do you feel about that. And you reflect on it and think of all the meanings that it has and so on. So that's just a good example of how the quadrants can deal with almost anything in existence because it's dealing with both the inside and the outside of all holons. And everything in the universe, as Arthur Kessler said, is a holon. It's a whole that's a part of other wholes. And that just increases indefinitely until you run out of space or whatever. But that's what sex and gender is. And I guess it assumes such a crucial space just because sex is such an influential drive for most human beings. I mean, for Freud, it was the only drive. So just to show you, I mean, a very smart man can just look at sex and just be overblown by it. So he must have had some pretty wild sex life. But in any event, um, and he saw it going all the way down to a 6-month old. So, okay. Um, but the necessity to decouple masculinity and toxic is urgent and absolutely necessary. We're never going to get beyond green if all we think is toxic masculinity. And that means everybody, man, woman, it doesn't matter. I mean, Kamala Harris, she floundered on the green because, well, in the background, it's a toxic masculinity field. And you can't get through that field without it blowing up. The little landmines of insanity, and they're planted all over green. So that's not only an issue, it's a very important issue. And I really urge people to think about it.
You know, one of the things that really stood out to me in rereading Trump in a Post-Truth World was a very nice passage that I thought was like a good ethical call to sympathy for ethnocentric people, right? Because you make this point that world-centered people often make the assumption that ethnocentric people know about world-centric values and
Right,
just reject them for some stupid reason. But in actual
right,
fact, they don't see that space
right,
yet, right? So we need to be engaged with them and sympathetic for them. That's an important emotional attitude for us to
right,
have. But it
right,
also led me to think of like, what do you think in general that the integral community or integral adjacent communities could do to be better about welcoming a healthy integral conservatism? Because we're not great about the right, whether that's like the traditional right or even some kind of right version of ourselves.
right.
How do we welcome a healthy integral conservatism?
Well, again, I think that so much of what we're talking about depends on education. In other words, conveying of a truth to a person, explaining it, and then letting them try it out, and then correcting them when they get it wrong. Um, but some variation of education is necessary to convey, particularly the truths of stages higher than the average person has reached. And that means higher than green, certainly, at the very least, higher than rational. Um, and so we simply need to explain it to them. And you can do that for any number of ways by picking whatever is the most interesting part of Integral that you think, and then explaining how it unfolds to the various stages. Um, and since we're on that topic, I would say that developmentalism itself is probably the least understood and the least included in philosophy, psychology, sociology of any factor of human beingness. You just never hear anything about it. And yet it explains, an enormous bit about human beings and the different worldviews they have. And the interesting thing about these stages, archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral, is that if you look back in history, you can see that historically we unfolded through these stages. So Homo sapiens, that is us, modern humans, first emerged probably around 500,000 years BCE. And from 500,000 years BCE to 50,000 years BCE, we were basically at the archaic stage of development, which means sort of the ape-like stages of human development. And then around 50,000 BCE, we started engaging in magic forms of thought. And so archaeologists and anthropologists are fond of pointing to cave art. So in the Paleolithic times, which was from 10,000 to 50,000 years BC. Human beings would draw animals on the walls, but the animals are often overlapping in strange ways. And some anthropologists finally figured out, oh, they're drawing magic because these things are magically intertwined with each other. And you can see these magic figures all over Paleolithic art. It's just like humans saw the world magically, they drew it magically, they thought about it magically, and that's where we got magic. And then when mythic unfolded, that again left a great imprint in us, and it also left us all of the world's great mythic religions. And I know people now read the Bible like it's the one and only true word of God. But it's a true word of God, but only in one of his 7 major stages of development that he put all of his children through. And I always think that's very funny because they're trying to give, like if you can even listen to Jordan Peterson's talks on Genesis. Genesis was written by a mythic mind. And so it's full of all sorts of mythic characters and miracles and supernatural stuff. And it's all mythic performing magic. Because remember, we took our magic and we put it in these mythic characters. So God can do a magic act on your behalf if you sacrifice correctly or pray correctly or know what to do. So that left us a very important imprint. But also as people started looking really deeply inside and trying to figure out what was going on, they stumbled into a process of waking up. And waking up is very different from a mythic version of reality. Because first of all, waking up is universally said to be the disclosure of an absolute truth. And everybody who has a waking up experience will stumble around and agree that terms like absolute truth seems to capture it as best as anything. So it's a very important experiential realization, and it unites time and eternity, space and infinity, individual and collective or universal or absolute, man and God. It's hard to think of a more powerfully important concept than, oh, I found my unity with God today. It's just a minor little thing. You might want to note it down, though. So it's very interesting that evolution, this randomized unfolding that transcended and included what went before, would go through these stages. And it's not that surprising that each stage was higher than the previous stage, because Kessler had already explained the nature of a holon to us. And as holons emerge, they're holes that are part of larger holes. So each stage got more inclusive and bigger and better. And that's why our evolutionary chain goes like that, because they're all holons. And that just explains that fairly well, I think. All of those are very important factors that are now part of our very makeup. And we still have at least green and integral, and there are 2 stages of integral. We call them teal and turquoise. And teal is also called paradigmatic because it's like a paradigm. And what green does, by the way, is the reason it's called pluralistic is when green emerges, it sees all these universal systems of rationality, because that's what rationality does. It creates universal systems of truth. So when you go from mythic to rational, there's no longer such a thing as Protestant chemistry and Hindu chemistry. There's just chemistry, a universal system that's true for everybody. And that's what rationality does, which is why it invented modern science, because that's what modern science does. It studies chemistry as it appears everywhere. It studies biology as it appears everywhere. It studies geology as it appears. So it has all these universal systems. And what Green does, because it involves a fourth person perspective of looking at everything that went before, it looks at all these universal systems and goes, wait a minute, there's something not right about just one system covering all places. Because the more I learn about all these different countries, I'll learn that they each have their own very real truths. And so we have what we call a multicultural view. And so what Green did is it looked at rationality and all of its universal systems and started busting those systems into pluralities or pluralistic statements. The one thing Green couldn't do is it couldn't figure out how to put all of those fragments together. It's just beyond it. It can see all the fragments, but has no idea how to hook them all up and make them into unified wholes. Well, that's what Teal does. That's what the first integral stage does. And developmental is also called the integral stage, systematic stages. But it takes all of these fragments and draws them together into what are called paradigms. And a paradigm is a unification of what appeared to be two different things, but they can actually be joined, like biochemistry is a union of chemistry as it appears in biology, and it's actually called biochemistry. And so that's what Green does. It goes around and it creates all these various paradigmatic statements. Although it can't do it all that well, and it tends to stay with meta-systemic, many different statements. But Teal is very good at making paradigms, and that's what it does because it has an integrative force. And so it looks at all those green fragments and it pulls them together into individual paradigms. So biochemistry, geopolitics, and so on. But what Teal can't do is pull together all those paradigms. That's what turquoise does. And so turquoise is called cross paradigmatic because it takes all of the paradigms that Teal created and draws them together into super paradigms. So like an integral theory would be an example of a turquoise cognitive system. What we try to do with integral is draw together all of the separate paradigms that Green created and that Teal fashioned into individual paradigms. And now we're going to make it into many paradigms drawn together into a super paradigm. So, well, that's what that is.
Okay, I think we're getting close to the end now, but I'd like to feel out your hunches about what an integral politics for the United States could look like in the decades to come. Like, let's suppose Trump turns out to be not that bad, and let's
Right.
suppose a decent version of green politics succeeds that, and then there's some integral politicians coming somewhere down the line. Where does that go? Like, what's your best case scenario for America from the point of view of integral politics? How does this turn out well? What should we be looking towards?
Right. Well, I think what's going to have to first happen is that we're going to have to get over wokeism because wokeism is a broken green. It simply splits the world into fragments and it doesn't have an clue as to how to bring them together. And that's going to have to happen because unless we can bring these fragments together, we're going to never get to Teal, or the beginning of integral stages. So I see that probably maybe 10 years. Um, and then when we get a fairly decent green to stand on and that can take our weight, then we can move into teal. And there will be drawing all the pluralities that green saw and created into paradigms. And that will be a major shift in how we look at the world. Because right now, even in universities, although I am glad to see that in the 50 or so years that I've been spouting integral stuff, that almost every major university in the country has one or two professors that know integral. And many of them have contacted me and I contact them. And they don't yet have a department of integral, but they'll usually teach classes in it. And so what will have to start happening is that those classes will have to continue to grow, and they'll grow into an actual integral department. And that's where everybody will go to get the real lowdown on how the world fits together. Because if you look around the world, it hangs together. It's a unified whole. Well, tell me about that whole. The only theory I'm aware of that can really do that is integral theory. It talks about first person, second person, third person, fourth person, even on up to fifth, sixth, and seventh, and eighth person. Jane Lovinger, who has come up with the most widely used test of self-development, she calls it ego development. She has 8 or 9 stages, and she defines each stage of development as adding a new perspective. So her first stage, stage 1, is aware of a first person perspective, or an I, me, mine. And as we said, that's the state we're born into. We're just aware of our I-ness. We can't distinguish it from the surrounding environment or so on. At second stage, we can add a second person perspective. At third stage, we add a third person perspective. At fourth stage, we add a fourth person. At fifth stage, we add a fifth person. Sixth stage, sixth, seventh stage, seventh, eighth stage, and eighth person perspective. And if you're having trouble thinking about how do I get all those perspectives, just think like fourth person perspective is an awareness of the previous 3 perspectives. So if you're thinking about, well, how does third fit with second, fit with first, you're thinking in a fourth person perspective. And then if you think, okay, well, how does fourth person fit into that? You're using a fifth person, and so on, sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth. And she explicitly has tests to show when you're at any one of those stages. And her test is the most widely used test worldwide to determine stage of development that you're at. So she's quite a figure in the field. And we're going to have to move into a healthy green stage. And that alone will clear up a lot of problems. Because the problem with wokeism or broken green is that it's always contradictory. So it says things like, for example, it's a very common belief in green that there is no objective truth. You hear this all the time. That's why I called the Trump book Trump and a Post-Truth World, because green is post-truth. It just doesn't believe in it. But notice what it's really saying is it's saying it is objectively true that there is no objective truth. Well, thanks. And it just gets worse. It's discombobulated in a very real way. And all of that would clear up if we just got to a healthy green. And then from healthy green, it's a fairly easy step into teal, because healthy green will present us with a bunch of healthy differentiations, and Teal will pull all those differentiations together into real paradigms. And when we become a world of paradigmatic thinking, um, you hear the word used now, and it usually means really profound or very deep. Understand? Well, it would be. We would be living in a paradigmatic world, and we would have all of these paradigms available to us. And then from there, we would, people on the very edge of that growth and development would start to look at, well, how do all of these fit together? Because they've got to fit together because the world fits together. And so they might actually start studying integral theory, for example. And I would be very happy. Um, but that is essentially what I see happening on a cultural stage. Um, and so, I mean, we can go into a lot of minor details, but that's the general drift. And again, I'm sort of emphasizing the growing up component because of all the components that I've listed, that's the one that is most people don't even know it exists, let alone can describe it, let alone know some of the actual stages of that development. So I'm emphasizing that, but I'm also emphasizing it because it is the single most important factor that has to come online for us to continue our growth and evolution.
Hmm. One last question. It just occurred to me that, traditionally philosophers and mystics like to have some distance between themselves and conventional society and especially politics, but were you ever tempted to get into the political arena yourself?
Well, I think I actually got out of that because when I was in high school, I was very politically motivated. And this, despite the fact that I went to four different high schools in 4 different years. And yet, from the eighth to the ninth to the 10th to the 11th to the 12th grade, I was elected class president or even student body president at every single year except 12, because I was just thinking about getting out. But I wrote constitutions for schools, and I was always had a political approach. So I always wanted to befriend people because they were my voters. And I mean, I just went through all of it. And I think the reason I didn't run in 12th grade is I'd had enough. I wasn't like I was so tired of it. I was just full of it. I had looked at everything it had to offer. I had tasted it and I was full. It was fun. And I've never thought of running for a political office again. So I guess that uh, is to my good fortune.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a wonderful conversation. It's been very
Sure,
nice spending some time with you. Appreciate all the thought and all the history that you put into all your answers.
sure.
Have a great rest of the day and hope to see you again soon sometime.
Thank you very much, buddy.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.